Are you enjoying the Singletracks podcast? Well, we could use your support. The small but dedicated Singletracks team works hard to share the mountain bike information that inspires epic adventures through this podcast, our worldwide database of trail maps and photos, and daily news and reviews on the website. So consider becoming a monthly, annual, or lifetime pro supporter and enjoy ad-free browsing on the website, free Singletracks stickers in the mail, and discounts on merch for as little as $3 per month. Go to singletracks.com/support to sign up and to find out other ways you can help support our mission. That's singletracks.com/support. Thank you and happy trails. Hey everybody, welcome to the Singletracks podcast. My name is Jeff, and today I'm going to be recapping some of my favorite conversations from the Singletracks podcast in 2021. So there are four main areas that we like to cover on Singletracks and also in the podcast. And the first of those areas is mountain bike trails. And so this year we talked to a number of mountain bike trail builders, also local riders who live in places like Moab and Sedona, and also a number of advocates both for trails and for the environment. We also talked to professional athletes, skills and fitness coaches, and even a few product designers and industry leaders. So one of the most enthusiastic guests that we had on the show was, no surprise, a mountain bike skills instructor by the name of Jeremiah Stone. He's taught hundreds of mountain bikers across the U.S., and he's also a freelance trail builder and machine operator, which gives him a unique perspective on riding and on trails. One of the questions that I asked Jeremiah was about today's mountain bikes and whether or not that makes it easier to be a good biker, especially compared to some of the bikes that were available, a decade ago to riders. We even touched on a topic that I hear from riders from time to time, which is that everyone should ride on a hardtail. And that's even a topic that we covered in an article on Singletracks. But here's what Jeremiah had to say about today's mountain bikes. Well, do you think today's mountain bikes make it easier to be a good biker compared to maybe some of the equipment that was available in the old days? Sounds like you started out on, pretty basic equipment and you probably struggled with it. But do you think like today's riders have it a little easier?
Well, I mean, that's kind of, in our clinics and in our lessons, we make sure to never bash anybody's equipment or never really talk about it because the best is the best you've ridden. People that have been on new bikes, like they understand how good new bikes are, but you get a lot of people that have never been on a good bike. Like you don't want to tell them how much better the new bikes are because then they're, anytime something goes wrong, they blame their bike. And it's like, ultimately the best bike is the one you're on. But, I think new bikes are way more forgiving. It's kind of a double-edged sword because you got to go faster and ride them harder to really bring them to life versus like you get on like an old rigid 26 and, basic trail speed feels like you're just giving her.
Yeah.
Versus like a modern enduro bike, like, feels like you're just waiting for the trail to get rowdy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, the equipment's amazing. I think that's a reflection of the progressive mindset of the sport as a whole, and I really enjoy it. But I try to keep people from getting too hung up on it. So
yeah, when you're doing demonstrations and you're in the clinics, like what kind of bike are you on? Are you on like a really blingy enduro bike and showing people how to do things, or a more basic one? And then also, what about that? Like, is a hardtail a better vehicle to learn on before you get into these bikes that are more capable?
Well, a little personal anecdote there. I live in a camper and van setup, and I travel with 5 bikes and a dirt bike.
Oh, wow.
So, I like all the bikes, so, but, for teaching, I try to equip myself with something that is relatable for the students.
Okay.
So like, that's usually going to be my trail bike, which is, it was a Santa Cruz Tallboy and it's currently an Evil Offering. And, it is a little blingy because I like that. I'm a gearhead, so I like nice parts and all that. And I really enjoy putting bikes together and all that. So it's a little blingy, but
Yeah. Did the students ever look at that and say like, oh, well, no wonder he can do that. He's on that awesome bike, you think? Or do they get it?
It's not as bad with the trail bike as it was whenever, like, I did notice I did a couple clinics. I've got my race bike is actually a mega tower that's all, push suspension and, just way overkill for anything anybody would ever need. But I love it. And like that one was definitely like that one kind of crossed the line. Like anytime I went down anything or off anything, everybody's like, "Oh, well, of course."
Yeah. Well, let me show you. I'll jump on that bike too. I can do that.
Yeah, they're like, "Well, anybody can do it with that." It's like so. That was whenever I was like, "Okay, I need to get a trail bike and make it a little bit more relatable." And then I also picked up a hardtail that I travel with that I use for like flow checking and then also for like training and all that. And it's just super versatile bike, but I kind of keep it ready. And I know one of these days I'm going to show up to a clinic and it's just going to be like all hardtails, and it's going to be like the stars are going to align, and I'm going to do a clinic on my hardtail just to show them like, here we go. Just kind of to make it relatable because mountain bikers, how mountain bikers are. Like we like to argue on the internet and we like to make excuses.
Right.
That's just how mountain bikers are. So yeah, I try to keep it relatable for everybody as well as I can. And having the trail bike definitely helps with that. And if worse comes to worse, you got somebody that's really hung up on it. I'm not above grabbing their bike and doing a feature on their bike.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
just to kind of break through. I mean, a barrier is a barrier, and my job as an instructor is to help break through that. So, whatever tool that takes.
Yeah. So one of the other things that I asked Jeremiah about is how to time mountain bike jumps. And for me personally, this is always something that I struggle with, trying to figure out the right amount of speed that I need to carry into a jump to maybe get over a double or to just figure out where I'm going to land. And here's what Jeremiah had to share about that. Timing seems to be a big factor when it comes to landing jumps, and particularly when you're trying to clear doubles, for example. How can riders develop a good sense of timing and speed? I know that's something that I struggle with. Is there a way to work on that?
Well, when's the last time you went out and hit a jump more than twice?
Right. Good question. Especially when you're on the trail, right? If you're not, at the bike park, just sessioning or the pump track. Yeah.
That's the big thing. Everybody wants those things, but people they want shortcuts. They want somebody on a video to tell them what's going to fix it. But like really, you got to find a jump that you like and that is, that's the right setting. And then you've got to go out and play with your bike. I mean, if you want to learn how to time the jump right, like you got to go and ride the jump and practice your compression and practice the release of that compression and timing it with the natural compression of a jump face and really dialing that in. And that takes repetition and time on the bike. And it also any rider will tell you, like, and any builder will tell you too, like not all jumps are created equal. So in my clinics, I actually travel with a set of ramps that we use for ninja clinics, and it's a really nice setup, and I love the ramps because it's super consistent. The lip is in the same place. The face is the same all the time. You can set it up wherever, and you can get riders a lot of repetition on that ramp. And it's the same every time. They're not having to worry about like some jump lines where it's like, okay, well, this one's got a lot of pop, and then this one doesn't have any, and then you got to hit the brakes for this one. It's like you're working with people that are just now figuring these things out. Like you need consistent. So yeah, we use those ramps, and they're just fantastic. We've actually been developing them more and more for our clinics to make them better and better. So it's a really good setup.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess, I've been able to get to the point where I'm comfortable with a particular jump, like you said, if I'm able to do it over and over. But then how does that translate into like something you've never seen before? Like you're comfortable with your jump or your local trails, but then how do you kind of translate that timing into something that might be new?
Oh man, that's a good one. Get comfortable with your jump and then find some of the other ones around there. And like before you hit it, look at it, like what's similar about it, what's different about it, what are some of the variables, and kind of trying to identify that thing, developing that eye. Like, is the approach faster? Is the gap is the table or the gap bigger? Is it more poppy? That kind of thing. That's where tabletops are such a good thing. You can go and kind of tell people it's like test driving the jump when you got a table.
Yeah.
You can kind of roll in at a safe speed, and you can feel at a lower speed where you're not fully committed to airing it out. Like, you can feel where the lip is, and you can feel kind of where the timing is, and kind of work into that, and then start dancing with it from there. And then ultimately it's going to be ride time, exposing yourself to as many of those different jumps as you can, and like paying attention to what you're doing and what the jump is and what's going on there. And then taking, you really need to have that eye and that understanding, for whenever jumps start getting a little bit higher risk. If you start looking at doubles, like, you better be able to read a jump face a little bit, like,
Yeah.
you don't want to just pedal into it and hope for the best. And then, another big thing that I tell people with going from tables to gaps is, think about what you're doing. In moto, I guinea pigged a lot of stuff on the dirt bikes, and you never come up short. Never. It's not even an option. I mean, first time you hit it,
Uh-huh.
I'm going deep. I'm sending it too far, and I'm preparing to land a flat. Like,
Yeah. Okay.
that's how I'm doing it the first time. And then if I come up a little bit short, then I'm actually in the sweet spot. If I go a little bit long, it's probably okay. Hopefully okay, but definitely better than nose casing something and going on your face. That's for sure.
Right. So yeah, your advice is to really like overestimate, if anything. Well, another topic that I'm really personally interested in is adventuring. I love reading books about Everest expeditions and people doing first ascents of mountains or, big bike packing trips around the world. And one of the folks that I got to interview this year was Dr. Kate Leeming, who is an explorer and adventurer who's biked tens of thousands of miles around the world. She biked around the continent of Australia, where she's from, and has also done some big expeditions in Africa, and has plans to do an expedition in the Antarctic. So I talked to Kate about how she deals with some of the struggles and challenges with riding, particularly on her trip in Namibia, where she was riding in the sand into a headwind and, really not making a whole lot of progress as she was going along. Here's what she had to say about having the right attitude.
Well, it's all about attitude. And, it's like it was the perfect training for Antarctica, because I was,
Mm-hmm.
got to learn how to deal with that mentally. And, normally on a bike, you have your cycle computer and you're watching that probably, and you think, I've got to do this amount of distance. And you can usually hit those because it's,
Mm-hmm.
even if it's a bit slower or something, you can hit them. But I don't know what I'm going to hit with the next pedal stroke, let alone anything else.
Yeah, it could be demoralizing to look at the GPS and to say, my goodness, it's been an hour and I've gone like 2 kilometers.
Yeah, well, certainly 5 kilometers an hour was what I was down to a few times. And I'm going, okay,
Wow.
I need to do 50 Ks a day to get my expedition done. So yeah. So the first bit was very hard I was just managing to, just creep up a little bit, get over the 50 a few times, and I was a couple of times under. So it was right on my limit. So I was right with that. And also when I do these expeditions, even though it would help to be super fit, it's crazy putting them together. It's probably the hardest thing I do is pulling all the ends together, getting everything, all the people or just moving out of my comfort zone in Melbourne here, and traveling around the world to get to a place and with everything that you need, and test to make sure my knee's all right. I do some sort of intensive training in the gym. I try to get out for a couple of rides to make sure it's real. But then, and often I even get a little bit sick before I start because it's so much stress.
Oh, man.
So
Yeah, I'm sure.
then to start from like you'd think is the most desolate place, and the wind is, especially in the afternoons, but not only. It was just amazing. So I was just trying to, with my mind, just think, okay, let's just break this down into little goals. Don't worry about distances. Just try to get the time done, and I'm going to keep moving forwards, and that's that's distance I don't have to do again. And it's just trying to find that right space in my mind, and it's such, even though it's desolate, even though it's harsh, even all of those things, it's also exciting. I can't pinch myself. I can't believe I'm doing this. How do you end up cycling down a beach in the middle of Namibia, or not the middle, but on the edge, in this place that's taken shipwrecks? It's the most treacherous coastline pretty much in the world, uncharted territory. It's coming across. Ships have been rusted down to nothing. A lot of them are no longer there, or frigate like the Dunedin Star, and all there's a tiny little bit of metal left, and that's it.
Oh, wow.
And those stories, like ships used to land, but it didn't guarantee that they survived because they didn't know where they were. Right. There was like nothing around hundreds of kilometers, and they didn't have any water or whatever. So actually just landing on the beach, saved them temporarily, but not always. Not all of them made it. So most of them, they did in some way if they got an SOS signal out. But so mentally, if you focus on all of those things and thinking this is quite amazing, I'm doing something that no one's done before. And I just love that kind of challenge. It's such a privilege. So if you focus on those kind of things, it also helps to get through mentally.
Well, one of the interviews where I learned the most, I would say, is when I spoke with Renee Hutchins. She's a mountain biker, storyteller, and artist living in Colorado, and she's a member of the Dene Nation, which is a Native American tribe here in the U.S. We talked a lot about land acknowledgement and also environmental justice issues. And here's what Renee had to say about some of the land where a lot of our favorite mountain bike trails are located and what the Ute Land Trust is doing to help protect those lands.
Yes, this is something that I plan on talking a lot more about this coming year, and just about the land trust model and what that is and what that could mean in terms of partnering, giving back, or engaging into healing those relationships with Native peoples. But the Ute Land Trust specifically, it was established in 2018 by the Ute Indian tribe to assist in the healing of those deep wounds left by the injustice of violent removal of their people from their homelands, which encompass Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona. So every land trust will look slightly different because, it's important to note that the tribal nations, they're unique. Each one is unique in terms of their language and culture. And so, we're not this monolith. And so that's important to keep in mind. And so if you look at that and how that works for land trust, is that each one is going to be different because while colonization and that violent removal or land dispossession impacts all of us, we can see that they're going to be in different regions geographically, and with their traditional knowledges and what they're doing is going to vary. But I know for the Ute land, we have through donations of land as well as through cultural and conservation easements that they're restoring land stewardship and that return of their ancestral lands. And by having that land and stewardship restored, they're able to have ongoing traditional conservation efforts and are reclaiming traditional knowledge today.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Is that something that's happening in other parts of the country as well, or is this sort of a new model? You mentioned that the Ute Land Trust was just established a couple of years ago, which is crazy that it took that long.
Yeah, so there's a whole history on this organization called Land Trust Alliance, and they actually have a webpage that kind of describes what land trusts are. And I think that it actually came about before when the Ute Land was established. These were conversations that were happening in the 90s. But I think it's important to know. I actually appreciate one of these quotes from a book called Braiding Sweetgrass. And there's a quote that says, in the settler mind, land was property, real estate, capital, or natural resources. But to our people, it was everything: identity, the connection to our ancestors, the home of our non-human kinfolk, our pharmacy, our library, the source of all that sustained us. And that, to me, is really a powerful quote, because it shows that this idea of ownership and land is not something that where this is where land trust came about. That's a very colonial or settler like definition of like, this is my land, I'm going to stake it, I'm going to claim it, it's nobody else's. But it's not that way for Indigenous people. We connect with the land as more than just this, physical ownership. That we, oftentimes I'll say to others that we are the land and that the land is us, and that these are our relatives. And so that's why these land trusts are huge. And they don't just come about just by land donations. I know that there's some in Northern California that are supported by voluntary kind of like a land tax. That basically people in this region realize that they are capitalizing on stolen land. And so as part of this, there's these really city and urban areas like in San Jose and San Francisco where people will, who live there will see just buildings and concrete, and it's hard for them to visualize that this was native land to begin with. And there's native peoples that are living in Northern California today. But there's no way that they're going to be like, okay, I want to take away San Francisco and, that's going to stay around. But the native people there are just saying like, hey, like we're still here. And, and we very much like need these traditional medicine and plants. And so there's been some cool like community gardens and shared spaces where a conservation, a non-Indigenous conservation land base will go into an agreement with the tribe and say, hey, let's both use this land, for our mission, and for what you need as well. And so there's, like I said, there's many different ways this looks. And I know that as cyclists, like last year, I don't think there's one place in the U.S. that didn't feel the impact of wildfires. It was very smoky and it affected our ability just to be outdoors. I mean, of course, COVID was also happening simultaneously, but out of this horrific situation, there was a tribe in Northern California that was part of their function of their land trust was actually practicing traditional fire management and really trying to work with the state of California to do this. So here's another example of how the land trust, it really is a collaborative effort and benefits everyone.
One of the interviews that I was probably most excited / nervous about was with Fabio Wibmer. And I've been watching Fabio's videos online for years now and just am blown away every time I watch them. Whenever he has a new video come out, I probably watch it at least a dozen times because they're so good and there's so many tricks. And they're long too. He doesn't do just, short little 3-minute shredits. These are usually like epic films that must take an incredible amount of planning and obviously a lot of skill to execute as well. So I got to talk to Fabio early in the year about his video Home Office and asked him about some of the tricks that he wanted to include in the video, but possibly wasn't able to. And I also asked him whether he considers himself a perfectionist. Here's what he had to say.
It can definitely happen, but I think like most of the time I can really judge my abilities, and I kind of like know what I could do. And most of the tricks, like home office, was super funny because I had those like couple of crazy ideas, and the things I did in the video. And I mean, like honestly, I wasn't sure if any of those tricks will ever work or not, or if it's just like in my mind that it can work. So yeah, but like theoretically, I thought, well, yeah, this might work, and if I just like try those things over and over again, there has to be the try when it works, and
Yeah.
it should be, and that was home office all about, just like trying, those tricks over and over again, and not giving up pretty much. There were tricks like the basketball trick where I hit the basketball with my rear wheel and it went into the basket. So that was one where I was sure, well, I don't think it's gonna work. But then, I had a couple of tries and I didn't really hit my rear wheel on the ball, and I was like, yeah, well, this might be tricky. But then there was a try where I hit it actually, where I hit the ball with my rear wheel, and it was like, yeah, well, as we had lockdown, you know, we didn't really have any time pressure, and I mean, we were at home, so we were pretty much just like messing around and doing things where we weren't sure if they're gonna work. But then in the end, like honestly, like all of them somehow worked out. I mean, the basketball trick I think took 500 or 600 tries until we got it. But it's yeah, it's quite funny that everything worked out, which I didn't think in the beginning. But yeah, with enough tries, you can do quite a lot. And also, those tricks, they weren't like super, super technical tricks, writing wise, I would say. It was more like, some funny things, some fun things which you have to try over and over again, and it's gonna be luck if it's gonna happen and if it's gonna work.
We must have to have a lot of patience to do that, to be able to try it over and over again. I mean, how many times did like the dart trick take for you?
Yeah, there was another one. Like we were actually playing dart a day before we had the idea, or like at the same day when we had the idea, and the next day we tried to film it. And we were playing dart, and my friend Hannes was he said to me, "Well, this would be amazing if you would like be able to shoot a dart pin with your bike." And I was like, "Yeah, well, there's no way how to do it." But then we were like, "Yeah, well, maybe there could be a way that it might work." And we're just bringing the bike, and I was just like trying to hit it with my handlebar, and somehow we saw that it's going into that direction, but it was like far away from working. So we said, well, if we're gonna give this enough tries, it might work. And then the next day we were trying to do it, and we were not able to do it, and it was just also super tiring. And then like the next day we tried it again, and like in overall I think I got like six punctures or seven.
Oh, wow.
It was just like a pain in the ass trying that trick and knowing, well, I might get another puncture now and have to repair it.
Yeah.
So that wasn't ideal, but then I think also after 400 or 500 tries it worked.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Geez, 400 or 500 times. That's crazy. Well, do you consider yourself a perfectionist? Do you get really angry, or what happens when you can't land a trick and you're having a hard time with it?
I think I'm definitely a perfectionist, yeah, when it comes to that. And I think my people who are working with me, it might be hard sometimes for them.
Yeah.
Because I'm just like, whenever something is like good and really good, I'm like, yeah, but I think we can do better. And I think we can have another try and maybe film it from that angle, or do it even better. And it's, yeah, it might be sometimes really difficult for me, but I also enjoy, trying to make, especially my videos and my writing, like as good as possible. And like if you spend a lot of time with something, it's always worth to go the extra mile and make it perfect rather than just leaving it at a 90%, where you know that it could be 100%. And that's just my attitude to like, either do it like full or with full energy, or not doing it at all.
Yeah. And I imagine your crew is there to kind of help you with that. Or are they saying, come on, that was good enough, let's move on?
Sure. I mean, they know me by now, and they know how my brain works a bit, I would say, which is definitely really helpful. And the crew, I'm working together with them now for years, and they were growing with me, so that's definitely cool. But I definitely had like quite some moments where they were saying, "Yeah, let's move on. We need to do other stuff, and the time is short."
Mm-hmm.
But and where I said, no, I want to try this, I want to get it perfect, otherwise we're not gonna move on. And
Yeah.
sure, it can be quite hard, but they always understand the way of how I'm thinking, and I think they also like really trust me in the process. And also for myself, it's super important to have those people around me where I know, well, if I'm telling them I'm gonna do, I don't know, 20 more tries on that, or even 50 more tries, they know why it's gonna worth it.
Yeah.
And why I want to do that. So having those people around is definitely super important for me.
Yeah. Another really enthusiastic guest that I got to speak with in 2021 was Gene Hamilton. And Gene is a former pro downhill racer who created one of the first mountain bike skills courses in the late 1990s. His company today, Better Ride, holds clinics around the US, and he's taught many, many regular riders and also pros as well about how to ride fast. Gene and I spoke for nearly 2 hours. One of my favorite parts of our conversation was when Gene talked about showing up for his first mountain bike race ever. And he got into mountain bike racing actually after he met Marla Streb, who was a professional mountain biker in the 1990s.
I'm like, these guys are beginners? And I started looking at their legs, and like, they've got calf muscles as big as my head, And I'm like, these guys are beginners. I'm like, uh-oh,
Yeah.
And then the race starts, and we had pre-ridden the course. Marlon and I had pre-ridden that course. I think the day before, or maybe a couple of days before. So when we pre-rode the course, and I thought this was going to be like the race. On the climbs, we would chit-chat.
Mm-hmm.
And then on the downhill, we would, kind of bomb the downhill to the best of our abilities.
Style.
Kind of enduro style, right? So I thought that was what racing was like, right? So, the gun goes off, and these guys with calves as big as my head, they just start sprinting as hard as they can. And I'm like, it's like I'm immediately in last place. And I remember snowboard racing is a 20 to 30 second event, right? Mm-hmm. I've never done an endurance sport in my life, and I know I've got asthma, like I have an inhaler and everything,
Yeah.
So all of a sudden I'm going as hard as I can. And it never relented.
Yeah.
I was like, I was expecting that we'd catch our breath at some point, but no, you just go as hard as you freaking can for an hour and a half.
Yeah.
And along the way, because I guess of my old BMX riding and probably from snowboarding, I was passing a few people here and there in the downhills, and as I recall, the numbers might be a little bit off, but there were 25 riders in my little beginner class.
Mm-hmm.
And, on the way there, I'm expecting to win, by a big margin. And I got 13th out of 25, right?
Middle of the pack?
Exact middle of the pack, right? And honestly, it was one of the most proud days of my life in my sporting career. I mean, I'd won plenty of snowboard races, but snowboard races don't require the kind of commitment a cross-country mountain bike race does. And I had never pushed my body that hard in my life, and honestly, I didn't know you could push your body that hard and not like have a heart attack or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
mean, I was just totally naive to the whole experience. And, so yeah, I was really proud, even though I expected to win and got 13th, just the fact I didn't die was kind of being,
Right.
and I beat half of those shave leg kids with their clipless pedals. I mean, I had toe clips.
Yeah.
I mean,
Jeez. My interview with Sean Madsen about mountain bike saddles has to be one of my favorites so far in terms of learning about mountain bike gear and equipment. And Sean is currently working for WTB as their saddle category manager. And he's really an expert in cycling biomechanics and has done a lot of groundbreaking studies about mountain bike fit and comfort and specifically saddles. And so it was really interesting to hear about some of the research that he and others have done on the topic of sit bones and how that translates into mountain bike saddle fit for riders. Here's what Sean shared with us about finding a mountain bike saddle that fits.
Sometimes it can be very challenging. And prior to a lot of the work that I did developing sizing with my previous work, we didn't really know, and everyone kind of picked as narrow a saddle as possible. But the reality is the human crotch is not designed to bear weight, but we're going to sit on a bike seat. Right. But we're going to sit on a bike seat. So how do we do that? How do we tackle that challenge? And the goal is, what can bear our weight is bony structure. That's what's designed. Our bodies are designed to sit on our bones. And so we want to make sure that we are supporting our mass on our bone structure and not our soft tissue. And so that's kind of the first goal is, okay, I want to sit on my bones. Now, if I'm going to sit on my bones, what are those bones called? There's, sit bones or ischial tuberosities, if we're going to be detailed about it. And those ischial tuberosities are very variable. So if I go in and measure, and I've done this was actually my master's thesis for physiology, was measuring this. The variety out there is anywhere between 80 millimeters apart and 160 millimeters apart. So that's a really wide span.
Whoa.
That's when we started realizing that, when I published that thesis, and then companies started looking at that and saying, oh, well, that's why a lot of people have trouble with saddles and some people don't, is that we were making all our saddles, and this was industry-wide, we were making all of our saddles for one type of person. And guess what? People aren't one type of people. There's a huge variety.
Yeah. And you can't just look at somebody either and say, okay, like you have wide or narrow sit bones. This is something like internal.
Yes, absolutely. The variety out there, there's no correlation between hip width, between pretty much anything, and where these sit bones are. I've measured, actually one of the widest people I've ever measured at 165 millimeters apart was an elite female runner that had this boyish, figure of like a 12-year-old boy. So very slender, very narrow, but her sit bones were very wide. I've also measured, NFL football players that, were massive individuals that had sit bones that were around 90 millimeters that were very narrow. So you really can't tell. I mean, yes, those are sometimes the outliers and the bell-shaped curves of averages, but you really can't tell. And the goal isn't to hit an average, right? Like, one of the analogies I always draw is that the average man's foot is a 42 and a half.
Mm-hmm.
Does that mean everyone wears 42 and a half shoes?
Right.
No. We want to custom tailor the experience for each rider, and each rider wants to know what works for them, and what works for your buddy doesn't necessarily work for you.
Right.
And that's okay. It's just figuring out, oh, okay, I need to support on my sit bones. I don't want to, I shouldn't be going numb. I shouldn't be having, issues where I can't sit on the saddle for an extended period of time. So I need to support those sit bones, and I need to get a saddle up underneath those bones that help support that. So measuring is the gold standard. There's many different ways of measuring. We can measure with, foam pads. They all have some variety of error. There's a couple tools out there that are more digital that are actually really accurate. When I did my initial work in all this, it was actually X-raying and correlating a lot of this stuff to X-ray. So we were able to see some very detailed oriented stuff, but that's not, plausible in a bike shop setting. Obviously you don't want to be doing that for average riders.
Yeah.
So, getting a measurement is the first start. And like I said, there's lots of different ways to do it. Working with somebody who's done a bunch of measurements so that they can be more repeatable and more accurate in their measuring will help.
Mm-hmm.
But again, the goal is to sit on your sit bones, not have any midline pressure. And then from there, there's a whole nother host of considerations, because that's just one consideration of choosing the right saddle, and that'll help you get to the right size. Some of the other considerations are soft tissue, right? And not meaning perineal soft tissue, but more like range of motion, flexibility, all these things that can happen and influence the way you sit on the bike and how you're using the bike. Also lend a way of how you're rotating your pelvis. So if you can imagine somebody who's got really good overall flexibility, and they go to, they're standing up and they go to touch their toes, and they can put their palms flat on the floor, and their back is, bent really far over, and that's, their pelvis rotates really far. That's going to influence how they sit on their saddle versus somebody who goes to touch their toes and can barely touch their knees, right?
Yeah, makes sense.
And so and it's really not about their back, it's more about how much their pelvis rotates. And so we think about, and why does that influence riding, is that when you pedal hard, and we've all done this, we have to climb up a steep hill, that steep fire road or that steep grunty climb. What do? Our torso comes way down. It's like we're almost eating our stem, right? Our stem's right up in our face, and some of it is to keep the front wheel down, but a lot of it is actually muscle recruitment. So when we do this, what we're trying to do, our bodies inherently, and our brains are doing this, we're trying to recruit more glutes. Glutes are the strongest single muscle in our body, and they're used for hip extension, right? So if I think about the pedal stroke, most of our power comes out of our glutes and our quads from pushing down, right? We push right down on the pedals. And in a maximal situation, in a really hard effort, our bodies automatically find that position where we can grab that power. Another good analogy, a visual, is doing a squat, right? When you put the weight bar on your shoulders and you're going to do a squat, how is your back and your pelvis aligned when you're doing that squat? They're kind of tilted forward and your spine is nice and lined, and you're using those glutes to push that weight back up. It's the same thing in a pedal stroke. You don't have a rounded out spine, and kind of slouching when you're trying to do a squat. That turns off your glutes. But that if you have the ability to tilt your pelvis forward and really recruit those glutes, that's going to influence obviously how you're sitting on the saddle and where your pelvis is contacting the saddle. So that's where we come into saddle shape, and this is a whole nother aspect of choosing a saddle. Is you've got width, but then you also have shape. So saddle shapes, some are really flat and some have some good contour to them. And how do we choose between the two? And that's a tough call. And that's where the overall flexibility and stability come into play. So if you have good flexibility, if you have good core stability, those types of things, you generally will tend towards a flatter shape, because that shape will allow you to tilt your pelvis forward, which you have the ability to do. And conversely, if you are a little bit limited in your flexibility and stability, you'll tend to gravitate more towards a contoured shape, or more, if you're viewing it from the side, a contoured shape, there's kind of a hammock in the middle of the saddle. It's kind of a cup, and it also can have some contour from left to right as well. Whereas flatter saddles, looking at them from the front, they're not perfectly flat, but they're much flatter than a contoured saddle as viewed from the side, tip to tail. And that allows that pelvic freedom. But again, if you don't have that pelvic freedom, then you want more of a cradle, which helps support your pelvis in that existing position.
Perhaps my favorite mountain bike athlete interview of the year was with Christopher Blevins. And Christopher, as most of you probably know, became the first American to win a World Cup race since 1994. Tinker Juarez was the last. And so it's been a long time since we've seen an American at the top of the podium. And I talked to Christopher, of course, about his racing, but we focused a lot about his work advocating for trails and the environment and a number of other issues. And I found it really fascinating to hear his perspective because he's a young athlete. And I think we're going to see the industry taking going forward into the future. Here's Christopher talking about using his platform as an athlete to advocate for issues like climate change.
Well, first and foremost, like the opportunity I have as a bike racer, as someone who gets to ride 20 to 30 hours a week and call that my job, is one of privilege. And it's one where I can learn so much through the bike. Like I started bike racing at a very high level when I was 5 years old.
Yeah, geez.
And, the bike has always been a classroom of sorts, And I'm just realizing now that the depth of learning that can come from riding, or stopping, to, and looking around after a ride sometimes is really immense. And it's also like, my experience riding and racing is very different than someone who's just getting into it for the first time. And that's special, right? That the bike has such a diversity of experiences people can have. And now with that, with the fact that I can learn so much through the bike, that's the opportunity that is truly a responsibility in some ways, but a special thing that I can undertake. Right. And I have a lot of indigenous friends on the Navajo Nation, and one in particular who's from the Blackfeet Reservation, McKaylee Oliver, who's in the film, and learning about how the bike is a form of expression in culture for them. It's the fundamental same, feeling of just riding your bike. But on the Navajo Nation, the trails that are there that people are building or rebuilding were initially shepherd trails. The bike is just a way to continue that tradition. And it's something that is entirely beyond the bike, right? Like it really is. And it's what I'm talking about with a connection to the land. And there's no better people to learn from and to lead these conversations than indigenous peoples who've, stewarded the land for centuries and have been forcibly removed at times, right? So as far as that relates to riding your bike, right? It's here. And it's like, it's one way to get out on the land and to have these conversations. So there's continued learning along this vein that I want to go on, but I'm fundamentally stepping into an understanding that like indigenous leadership and issues of the climate is really important.
Over the years, I've interviewed a handful of CEOs in the bike industry. And this year, one of the most interesting conversations I had was with David Billstrom, who's the CEO of Kitspo. David was surprisingly open about their cost structure and how things like shipping costs factor into apparel prices, and why specialty cycling apparel is particularly well suited to domestic production.
The entire industry is really beholden now to global shipping. And again, another example of what we all experienced during the pandemic. The shortages on various items across the spectrum was caused by those what we might call shallow supply chains, which is really a fancy word for saying there's a slow ship coming from some foreign location, and it has to get here, then it has to clear customs, then it has to get on a truck, then it has to go, so on and so forth. So our rule of thumb is that if it goes by ship, it's going to cost us about 50 cents a shirt. And if it goes by airplane, it's going to go at about $2 a shirt.
Oh, wow.
And I often find people are shocked to hear that we use airplanes to ship product. But in fact, this is This is one of the many ways that bulk manufacturing is inappropriate for specialty industries such as cycling, and certainly for emerging brands. So until you're doing about $10 or $20 million worth of business, when you contact Vietnam or Bangladesh to make your clothes, you are the smallest customer they have.
Right.
And when their manufacturing capacity gets squeezed by the big boys, you're going to go to the back of the line, even though you ordered your clothes the previous Christmas.
Oh, wow.
So when your clothes are finally finished, then you pay for the air freight. And Kitspo is not alone in constantly and continually paying to air freight finished product from an overseas location to the U.S. in order to meet schedules.
Yeah.
It's nuts. And think about that carbon footprint. We're spending jet fuel on shirts.
Right.
It just boggles the mind.
Right.
These are many of the things I started to learn as I got into Kitspo and instead of being on the outside of Kitspo.
Yeah.
And there are multiple disadvantages. It's not just the shipping cost. There is the fact that most brands, not all, but most brands, the design work is done in the United States, but they can literally send a picture from their phone of a napkin sketch to the factory in Vietnam, and they'll be happy to do all the product design the detailed product design in Vietnam, and then FedEx a sample. And that has become seductive, but at the end of the day, it means that these brands in America, and I include Kitspo's first 4 or 5 years, we don't own the pattern. So, I came up from a technology background. The idea that I would have a successful product, but I don't own the intellectual property, I can't even get a copy of it because it's locked up in the factory in Vietnam to make sure I don't switch factories. That's nuts too.
Yeah.
And then I mentioned a few moments ago that we have to make those orders 12 months in advance. In fact, 9 months in advance sometimes is possible, especially as you get to become larger and more important to the factories. But for most brands, it's a 12-month product cycle.
Wow.
So the way I usually explain that part is I want you to imagine that I'm gonna place orders for shirts. And I'm going to order, I have to order the minimum quantity is 300 or more likely 500 of each color. So while I'd like to offer 5 colors, I choose 2 because that's what I can afford.
Right.
And I choose red and blue, and I have to send them 70% of the money I have to send when I place my order.
Wow.
So in January of 2020, I would need to send Vietnam 70% of the money on my 500 red shirts and my 500 blue shirts. I will receive those in October or November if they come by ship. And before they are put on the ship, I have to pay the last 30%.
Wow.
So the cash flow here is that if we assume I have a 50% margin and I'm buying those shirts, I've paid for 500 shirts, the list price of 500 shirts, and I'm getting 500 red ones and 500 blue ones. I put those out on the internet. I put those out in stores. And the rule of thumb in the business is if those don't sell like hotcakes in the first 3 to 4 weeks, then I start marking them down.
Wow.
Because
that's
I've
quick.
got all the money tied up into them.
Yeah.
And I've got to get the cash back so that I can order some more shirts for next year.
Right.
And the dilemma is, let's say, for no fault of my own and no way for anyone to predict it, the red shirts sell like hotcakes and I'm out in 2 weeks. The blue shirts languish.
Right.
So what the apparel industry does, generally speaking, is mark them down after 3 or 4 weeks, mark them down again, and then send them to the landfill.
Oh, wow.
Because they become so unprofitable that to try to get rid of them in any other way is just adding more transportation cost.
Right.
Because I would have to ship them to somebody else.
Right.
And believe me, I've got to pay for the shipping. So to cut my costs, they go to the landfill. There are some industry experts that estimate as much as 30% of all the finished goods and apparel made worldwide go to landfill.
Oh my goodness.
It is
That's a lot. It's a lot of shirts.
It's incredible, and of course, it's disgusting in this age that some people are going unclothed, and all of us are suffering from the environmental damage of trashing those clothes.
Yeah.
So
Jeez.
so there's a double jeopardy. Remember the red shirts that sold like hotcakes?
Yeah.
I'm 9 months to reorder those to get more.
Right.
And when they arrive, we spin the roulette wheel again. Now red's out of favor. So I tell everyone that if you're good at that kind of bulk manufacturing in apparel, then you probably are in the wrong job and you should work in Las Vegas.
Finally, one of my favorite conversations from the year was with Dr. Adam Phaneuf, who's a doctor of chiropractic with a degree in exercise science. He and I spoke actually twice this year on the podcast. And in our first conversation, I asked him how mountain bikers can tell if their bars are too wide. Here's what he had to say.
The age-old kind of adage of if you're clipping trees consistently, then your bars are probably too wide definitely rings true.
That's how I go too. But yeah, that's my rule of thumb. But the problem is all my trails are so narrow here. I'd be running like 600 millimeter bars, and that's not going to cut it.
Yeah. So, it really bar width, it does have a lot of nuance. You have to look at your riding style. Are you really, and what you really like to ride? Are you kind of do you really like just like smash down trails and be in that kind of retracted shoulder position constantly? Well, then a wider bar is probably going to suit you a little bit better. Are you looking for a combination of, are you trying to improve your handling a little bit? If your bike is feeling a little sluggish, or if you're, having trouble negotiating all the switchbacks on your local trail system without hitting your knees, then, we might be looking at a shorter bar. There's a lot of nuance, but, I think that most people can run a little shorter than what comes stock for them, or what they try and run. There's a whole range of proportions and whatnot. So there's no hard and fast rule. I know there's a lot of opinions and even some formulas out there for determining bar width. But they're all based on assumptions about body proportions and bike geometry, and those just vary so much. So, wider isn't always necessarily better. But there are even big riders who probably could use more than an 800 millimeter bar. So
I've tested bars with 820s. I mean, they keep going up.
Yeah. I mean, and I think, especially those extremes have been underserved in the past for, really big and really small riders. And I think, now that we're kind of starting to see that economy of scale kind of improve, and more people are riding, I think there's more offerings for things that match. But I mean, if you look at any like pro lineup, whether it's like a downhill race, enduro race, cross country race, the bar width is all over the board. And a lot of it has to do with proportions. Again, some people just really like being in a really, retracted, shoulder position. The problem that we run into is when we go too wide, we do start to get into this position where we're in such a deep shoulder retraction from the get-go, just to be in a balanced position on the bike, that we're actually losing leverage from our shoulder. We're actually putting our shoulder at a mechanical disadvantage. And that's something that I try to look for when we're fitting like somebody who has wide bars and who's like either complaining of shoulder pain or is looking to improve their handling. Those wider bars really they facilitate a lot of elbow bend right off the bat. So, and if that's not what they've, if that's not how they like to move, or that's not their position in their riding style, then that's something that we have to change. So,
yeah. I mean, you make a good point that a lot of folks maybe could go a little narrower than whatever their stock bar is. And I'm sure that's on purpose, right? I mean, bike companies are going to put the widest bar that they think people are going to need, and then obviously you can cut them down. But I guess a lot of us don't think to do that. We're like, I paid for this whole bar. I'm not taking any pieces off of it.
I am not letting one piece of this go.
Right.
Yeah. And I think bike manufacturers, they're trying to serve the most people. So they're not gonna spec a bar that's going to be too narrow for a handful of people. They're going with the greatest common denominator. And then, I think there is some expectation that we fine tune bar width as we go. And it can be something, you don't have to bite off a lot right off the bat. You can, you can experiment with it a little bit. And you can make small incremental changes. I think that, especially in bike fit, if we do have to make a large change, if there's a big change that we have to make during our session, often I won't make that entire change right away. We'll kind of meet halfway, and we'll get some time on the bike, and then we'll come back and revisit the fit, and then kind of make some more change.
Of course, those aren't all of the conversations we had, and even the ones we included here, that was just a short portion of the interview. So if you missed any of these shows or want to hear more, be sure to go back and find the episodes online. Most Singletracks podcast episodes are about an hour long, and so we're able to really dive in and get a lot of details on a number of topics from around the mountain bike world. Be sure to follow the Singletracks podcast if you aren't already, because for 2022, we've already got a slate of really interesting interviews all lined up. That's all we've got this week. We'll talk to you again next week and next year. Peace.